Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 81, Q&A Catchup, trade show status, thread selection, background builds, and more. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Sorry for the delay. I had some microphone issues, but we are back up and running, and hopefully we'll be able to give you all the content that we intended to give you today. But if anything else, I am happy to be back. I know we had a little bit of a break with last week's Decorated Apparel Expo show, though that does give us some opportunities because we do have some things to talk about related to that. Because the first thing when I said to everybody, hey, what do you want me to cover next week? What would you like to see? Coming off of this break, and invariably people were saying, what are the trade shows like? What's going on at DAX? How was it out honestly in a pandemic world? What are we doing now? How is it going as we have kind of the rise of people being concerned about the Delta variant and everything else? And so I am going to talk a bit about that today. I'll talk a little bit about trade shows. I'll review some of the stuff going on at the Decorated Apparel Expo, and also I'll talk about upcoming shows because I still have 2 more events that I'm doing next week, very shortly, before I am done with my trade show season for this year. So we'll definitely have that to talk about. And I'm going to try and cover some of the topics that we didn't get to cover last week. We certainly, or not last week, 2 weeks ago when we were finishing up our mailbag episode, talking about building up backgrounds and things like that. But I'm also going to cover some of the things that came up, honestly, in my classes. Things that were asked of me either during class or after classes that I think are interesting and as much that they discuss what we do in our digitizing and what some of the terms that I've talked about before come to, some of the things that are frequently mentioned on this show, and things that I might need to clarify more. And certainly as part of this talk about trade shows, as we begin this today, I'm going to discuss a little bit about what I think people got from the trade shows, how the trade shows are operating, and certainly what I think we can get from trade shows and what I think maybe should be changing or what should be done differently either on our sides or on the sides of the people who are attending. So certainly some of that going on. I know this is not everybody's topic all the time. Sometimes we want to get into more digitizing, embroidery, drawing, and creativity. We will get into some of that today, and we will continue to get into that as we go on through next week. Next week, probably going to have either another break or a different kind of show, maybe a pre-done show or a different schedule, because we do have another trade show. I'll be in Fort Worth, Texas, doing a trade show there. So we'll have that coming up shortly, doing a much shorter episode, or a much shorter show rather. Because for me, I did a really long digitizing heavy session, a 3.5-hour session with breaks over at the Decorated Apparel Expo show, the Elevating Your Embroidery Digitizing sessions with like 3 topics therein. Much longer session than I'm going to be doing. Coming up, we're doing one that's about specialty thread, and you're going to see me as well as our own embroidery nerd, Jeff Fuller, on stage, essentially doing a panel, a Q&A panel, something like you may have seen us both do online, hosted by the good folks at Madeira USA. So Sam Young will be hosting that, and that's all in Fort Worth. But with that, let's say hi to a couple of folks who have showed up, and then we will go ahead and get into the discussion of trade shows, get into the discussion of what's going on with that, essentially with what's live in trade shows right now. What's the deal? How are we doing this? How are people reacting? How are people carrying on? But first, let's go ahead and just say hi to a few folks. We have Wade here. Wade says, hey, Wade, happy to have you on and watching. And I'm going to say I've got some destinations that are not connecting correctly over here with StreamYard. It looks like we're having some issues with comments and with comments coming back. So if you didn't get on, let me know. It looks like all I have right now, mostly I'm getting comments in from Facebook. So if you're on YouTube watching this, you may not be getting on. I may not be seeing you in the counts. But Frank is also in from the UK. Thank you for sharing, as always, Frank, and for spreading the good word about Embroidery Surf. Good evening to Frank. We have Joe Rita on, who, by the way, got to meet Joe Rita. She was at the Decorated Apparel show at DAX and got to see some of her incredible embroidered landscapes. She's done some fantastic work, and especially for someone who didn't start digitizing for until fairly recently. Quite stunning work, very good textural work that I was very happy to see. So thank you for coming out, Joe Rita. It was a pleasure to meet you and a pleasure to have you in my class. And she says, hello to everyone. So hi, Joe Rita, happy to have you here. Marianne from MAS Embroidery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, close to my hometown and definitely my home state. Hello to you. Happy to have you in. Oh, looks like we got some of the Facebook or some of the YouTube comments coming in now. Lori Paulini says, hello. Hi, Lori. Happy to have you here. And Howard's coming in from Florida. Howard, happy to have you in as well. So guys, thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being here for the Q&A. And if you have anything you want to add, like I said, derail me, change the topic today. anything you want to discuss that is embroidery or embroidery adjacent, creativity, business, apparel decoration, I am definitely here for it. But certainly going to grab the comments as we go through here. Like I said, this is here for you, and certainly I'm responding to stuff that you guys have asked. If you have something you want to hear about better, or that you want for next week or weeks to come, by all means, hit me up in the comments. If you're here live, join the conversation. If you're listening, still drop something into the comments. Let me know. Reach out, contact me. Might not always be great at getting back fast, but I do try to get back. All right. With that, we also have John coming in. John says, "Hi, Eric. Happy Friday. I'm in the middle of 300 shirts, and you're a great distraction." Yeah, happy to do that for you. I have been there many a time, my friend. So happy to see that. And by the way, love that your icon on Facebook there is a shirt being run in process. Everybody loves process pics, and everybody loves to see machines running. Lyndon coming in, also saying hi from North Carolina. Thank you for being in, Lyndon. All right. So let's get into it. Let's start discussing kind of what's going on, because the first thing was I want to just kind of give you guys a little bit of a rundown of how DAX went, the Decorated Apparel Expo shows. So we finally saw the last of the Decorated Apparel Expo shows. August 27th, 28th, DAX Chicagoland happened. And as you guys know, I was there teaching Elevate Your Embroidery Digitizing. That was the session that I was doing. And like I said, 3.5 hours of as much digitizing as you can handle. And as I always say in those classes, and probably what I should say when I open up the Takeup is, hey, I'm Eric Campbell. We're here to talk about embroidery and digitizing. And if you don't like embroidery digitizing, you're in for a rough 3.5 hours. Well, here you'd be in for a rough hour if you didn't want to listen to me talk about embroidery digitizing and the business. But yeah, DAX Chicagoland did commence last week. We had that happen. Previously, the week before last, we finished that up, and it was honestly, it was a really great show. It had a lot going for it. And I think that Chicagoland's always really great. The area is fantastic and the venue is fantastic. Tinley Park is one that I've always really enjoyed. Tinley Park outside of Chicago is a great area. And the venue itself is fantastic. The convention center is fantastic. I will say, certainly, talking about trade shows, if we want to discuss kind of how they went, what they look like, what was it like in this particular venue, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys a little bit of the Decorated Apparel Expo Facebook feed. We can see a couple of the pictures of what was going on, so you can just kind of see what it looked like. I mean, I've got a ton of tabs up here from the links list. By the way, links list is here, so I'll get that placed up for you guys as well. You can see me copy that live. But here's the Decorated Apparel Expo show stuff. And like I said, they were thanking us all for coming out 2021 shows. I think the great thing that we all did was support the show. And something that I think I'm going to have to stress here. Was this a normal year for trade shows? Absolutely not. The behavior was different. The size was different. The vendors and their willingness to participate was different. However, I think those of us who would like trade shows to continue and who would like to continue getting education, having vendors show up for trade shows at all, purchasing things with some more information and hands-on training, we're going to have to support trade shows during this period and try and help them figure themselves out. Now, certainly, lots of things going online. I'm actually a big proponent of doing online education. You guys know that not only through Embrilliance, but certainly through the decorator community as well. I've been doing online classes more and more in this last couple of years. But the truth of the matter is I still feel like there's a lot of value in trade shows so far. And I like the idea of hybrid shows more than I like the idea of losing the shows entirely at this point. But what I'm going to say is certainly there is a portion of me that thinks, yes, there is some difference. Yes, things haven't been certainly not the same as a normal year. If we go up to the top of the Decorated Apparel Expo feed and look at their cover picture, this is what a normal DAX year looks like. It is wall-to-wall people. There are booths that are fully filled out. The spaces are fairly packed, even though this happens to be a smaller, more regionally focused show. It's a Midwestern trade show. So this is a little different than things like if you go to Impressions Long Beach in California, generally in January, that's a big show with a large international contingent and the floor is quite large. I would say, though, with all of those extra people and with that destination being what it is, you probably get a little bit less one-on-one attention from your vendors, but you do get a large number of vendors in a normal year, and you get to see a lot of new equipment, and most big things are going to be launching that in that January show at Long Beach for Impressions. Impressions Expo is huge. But then Decorated Apparel Expo, what it always has going for it in any year is the fact that it tends to be a little more focused. There are regional businesses, and it focuses more on the kinds of businesses that are being, that are prevalent in the areas where the shows are are around. And like I said, these are generally Midwestern, and they are regional shows. But normal year, they are fully packed, like you see here at the top of the page. But as we go down through, you can see they're showing some of the busier elements that we had going on here. And we had a couple of busy spaces, but what I'm going to be honest with you is just to say that there weren't quite as many vendors. And we had, even though we didn't have the quite as light a show as we had in the previous shows, the Chicagoland show was still pretty light. I will say, however, that it was more steady. Chicagoland show, I think, honestly, being where it is, it tends to be the most well-attended show out of the DAX shows. And it was a little more steady in the overall version. There were more people there overall, but it was a steady trickle rather than rushes. Whereas talking to the people who were there in the booths, most of the time there were, when we go to the DAX shows, you'll have these rushes and you'll have people running out to the scheduled conferences back and forth. And so we have this kind of pulsing sense of like a tide of people that shows up in between class periods, things like that. This time we didn't have the shorter seminars. We only had the longer workshops. And I think that means that people were either locked in for education for one of the 2 days, or they were on the trade show floor, but there were a lot of people who only got certain elements out of it going at the same time. So it was kind of like we didn't have quite the same number of people that we usually do. But we did have, like I said, a more steady trickle, and especially in the Illinois show, in the Chicagoland show. And by the way, I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple people in here. We have some comments still. Ramona says, sorry, I'm late. I was working on my procrastination list. Always a good thing to do. And don't worry about being late. What it looks like to me is that we had some technical issues again. Like I said, I was having some issues with my mic coming up earlier too. Jeff says, just got here. Facebook didn't give me the notification. Yeah, I don't know. I'm having issues right now with StreamYard. Something went really weird with it not wanting to recognize any of my audio locally as well. So if there's a problem, like I said, I also wasn't getting YouTube feedback or comments or counts. So if anybody is having an issue, I do apologize. Hopefully everybody is getting in and can see us now. But suffice it to say, if you're listening to this later, don't ever feel bad. Sometimes shows are better or less attended, as we know at the trade shows this year. And Marianne says, glad you're staying busy embroidering. Yeah, glad for everybody to be busy embroidering. Anybody who's busy or too busy to comment, that is perfectly fine. Don't comment. Keep those needles moving up and down. Keep that industry rolling. That's what we're here for. But let's go ahead and finish talking about Decorated Apparel Expo, or at least kind of get through some of the commentary here, because I think a lot of people are really curious about how it worked out. And what I'm going to say is we still had live people there. We still had people showing up. There's Aaron and Todd from OSG. So you guys know Aaron from the half and two other guys and everything else that we do. And there's my ugly mug, though at least I am featuring the Brilliance Black and Yellow, as I often am. And you can see that I have hijacked my hotel flat screen to run my slides. So yes, have HDMI cable will travel, and yes, will indeed hijack your flat screen. I guess you better glue up all your ports if you don't want me to do that. But what I will say about it is that the DAX show was still pretty lively. People were there. And this is what I'm going to say about the vendor side of it. The vendors that decided to show up got all of the business that was possible for their markets, because it seemed like pretty much we had one key vendor for most things. So that is part of what's driving the issues in general at trade shows right now. Vendors are deciding to omit themselves from the trade shows for this season. And it's a question that everybody has to answer for themselves. It's not something that I'm trying to necessarily opine on, because the risks are there and they are what they are. But that is causing some of the closures in some of the lighter shows. When vendors aren't showing up, it's much harder for the shows to put on a large floor space. And if they have already taken some precautions by not having quite as many gatherings or collections of people, or running all the small classes like we usually would do, that means that we kind of don't have enough to put certain things going on. And that's one of the issues there. It's just one of those things, I have to say. When there's less for us to bring people in on, we don't get as many people. If we don't get as many people, then the vendors start to back out even more for that too. We have this kind of cycle that goes on where the attendance can kind of circle out. It really depends on people's feeling about the risks that are involved. And certainly I'm going to admit, if you look at the pictures that we had here from DAX, I don't have any problem with what I'm seeing generally, but there were certainly, I would say, spotty adherence to safety guidelines. And this was not by anybody who is supposed to be doing anything. It wasn't anybody who was official. And you can see by and large, people, especially when it was busier, were wearing masks and doing what they need to do. But like I said, it really depends on the people involved, and there wasn't just a ton of people trying to police that stuff either. So if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, yeah, you're probably going to find that depending on the show, depending on the area you're in, depending on the tenor of how things are being enforced, not everybody was into enforcing all of the safety protocols that might have been involved. And that's just the truth. What I will say is for traveling, I had absolutely no issue in traveling. I flew all over the country in this last couple months, and in flying, I had no issues with that. I know we've seen some horror stories about people freaking out on planes. People wore some pretty jerk t-shirts and masks and things to make sure that everybody knew they were dissatisfied with one side or the other on any particular argument. But mostly that's about as far as I saw it go. There really wasn't too much more going on. What I will say is that in public spaces, in restaurants, in wherever there is, if someone has a reason to remove their masks, most people seem to be doing so, at least in the places that I was at. And so if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, you do have to think about that, certainly. I know that as we're going up to the next set of shows, and like I said, I am attending 2 more shows before I'm done for this year. I am going out to Fort Worth. So impressionsexpo.com/Fort Worth, if you want to check that out, that is next week. And next weekend, I will be teaching Friday morning is the big session that I'm doing. And then we also have the round table, kind of the presentation where Sam will be there with Jeff and myself for Madeira. But yeah, I start early morning on Friday teaching specialty thread, and that's an hour and 15-minute session, shorter session. But what I do know from Impressions Expo is that they are absolutely asking everybody to follow guidelines. People are masking, social distancing, and the rest. I will say when you're in a trade show setting, the spacing's harder to maintain than other things are. Masking does seem to be happening. And even, like I said, even in Chicagoland in Tinley Park, we did have officials coming around on the second day of the show. And we actually had people who were officials from the city, I believe, come in and ask us to take care of things, ask everyone to make sure they were masked up. So really, it depends on your comfort level with that. But I will say that by and large, everyone is starting to ask people to mask up, and all of the venues are trying at least to require everyone to mask up, maintain distancing, no matter your vaccine status. So like I said, I don't want to put too fine a point on it. I don't want to try and make this difficult for anybody to select. These are just the things that are going to be out there right now and real. Whatever you feel about them, I'm masking up. I didn't have a problem with it. I will say during my presentation, when I was standing at the front of the podium, or well, at the front of the room, not really at a podium. They don't do podiums, but I'm standing and presenting, 10, 15 feet away from the first person that's there. I took off my mask so people could hear me. But at the same time, I think that by and large, most people were staying masked as much as they can. And especially on the show floor, there was more of it than there were in other areas. But like I said, depending on where you're at, it may or may not be a thing for you. But restaurants, areas like that are much less likely to have people trying to mask up. And generally they'll use the reason that they're eating to take it off and keep it off. So like I said, depends on how you feel about that. There's still a lot of virtual stuff going on. I know Impressions has Impressions U, and a lot of people are doing more of the virtual education, and you can get virtual versions of almost all that education as well. However, I will say that in working the trade show, getting to meet people was impressive and important to me, even though we had to be more careful about physical contact, stuff like that. People really do have to think about the fact that there is something different about coming together and having questions kind of percolate together. I know it sounds funny, but when we all come together and we start to ask questions and other people in your vicinity have questions that you didn't even know you had, there's a chance for learning that is something that's slightly bigger even than what we're doing here. Because whether or not I'm doing it in any bad way, I'm curating what's being read from the comment section. We aren't in a big live area. It's harder for you to interrupt me. And even in the online classes, we do live sessions, which is why, by the way, I always do all my classes live first and I record them as a live session, because I think that interaction is important and it does actually bring things up that I might not have thought of in preparing my own classes. However, once someone watches that recorded the second time, that recording is never quite as immediate and live as the original material was. So there is still something there. And I'm going to say there was still discovery to be had. Now, certainly, there was less of the kind of discovery of equipment, materials, and things that we would expect. because there were just fewer vendors in general. However, there were vendors there who were very attentive. And as I know, the people who were there vending had a tendency to be writing orders. They were there. They were, especially when some people were there and walked in saying, today I'm buying a machine. Today I'm buying thread. Today I am buying materials, and I need to walk out of here with, with an order made or with a contact made or with my new sales rep. Those people were writing orders and giving out information and doing well. I will say, though, that it's very easy for me to say that as an educator and an attendee, because I just have to show up and have my person there and have my presentation. I have a backpack with a laptop. That is about what I need to have there, aside from the fact that I carry a tremendous number of my live samples so that everybody can see work and discuss that work. When someone has to put together their own employees, an entire booth, they have to travel, they have to book, they have to have all these resources put into that, and they have to have their own people there, and assuming whatever risk that we all are assuming by going, that can be a different question entirely. And I know, especially when we're talking about the larger shows, they may be dealing with larger corporate entities that have different rules, certainly, than others. And that's something that I know as we come up to the last shows of the year. Printing United, that was going to happen in Orlando, and it's a big show mostly for printing, certainly had an apparel section that was being worked on, and embroidery was certainly being talked about as part of that apparel section of that show. Printing United was canceled, but I know part of that really has to do with the fact that enough vendors pulled out to cripple the floor is really what happened there. Once again, I can't argue with that, especially because of what's going on with numbers in Florida. It's not my place to argue with that. What I will say is that's what's happening right now. We are still carrying on. Fort Worth is carrying on. You're going to see me there. You'll see me immediately after that at the Shirt Lab event that those folks are holding. So the Shirt Lab is holding an event, and I'll be talking there as well about, and this is more business focused, sales focused. So events are still happening. I would say that they are cautious, certainly, and that people are being careful, but probably not as careful as you might. If you're very much concerned about this, you're going to see people who are taking off masks, who are not social distancing, and who are touching. This will be happening in your vicinity if you go to a trade show. I think that's fair to say, and I think it's fair to let people know that's happening. And honestly, for me and for all the people that I knew who were exhibiting, we were all fully vaccinated, and that's how we felt. We were trying to be safe and what have you. We were wearing masks on the show floor. All of the people who were exhibiting that I knew that I was talking to in their booths were masking up and being as careful as they could be. But the attendees are a different matter altogether. That's up to them. That's up to everybody's individual kind of personality and desire to do that. So without anything becoming political, that's what happened at the show floor. This is what I think was valuable to notice. There are some people who absolutely just do better with education, with discussing things in person, who want to have that interaction. And despite the fact that a lot of us may have this, especially those of us who are kind of born into and raised in an online space, or at least became kind of native denizens of the online space, where that's where we live. We live in online groups. We live in social media. Those of us may be tempted to think that trade shows are outmoded or that nobody really wants them. But having been there in person, there were tons of people who were absolutely excited to get back to trade shows, who felt that there was a need for it, and who wanted to be in person more than anything, both in education and in literally getting hands-on time with equipment. That was a big thing. And I heard a lot about people who were kind of wanting to see more equipment and unhappy. Like one of the things I got talked about in Serial Guys this morning about the show is that nobody was there running sublimation on the floor. So if you know sublimation printing, so it's like sublimation dye printing. It's a heat printing method that works on polyesters. Sublimation printing, there were no machines on the floor. Nobody was discussing it. And I will say this, for the people who showed up to do sublimation printing and couldn't find it, they might be looking at, say, like white toner transfer printing, something that was being sold by like the folks over at the Magic Touch, where they have transfer papers that really feed into that. It's a similar space. It's not sublimation, but I'm sure that they saw more traffic because they were present. That happened. And there were still people who really want to talk to somebody in person and to have that interaction. And honestly, I think there's some portion of it where they would like to have someone they can hold accountable and discuss things with and have their own real rep they know is their person they talk to. There's still a contingent of people who really would like to work that way. Some people are cool to make massive investments online. Some really want to talk to a human being first and want to see them up close and personal before they invest the kind of money it would take to buy equipment, especially commercial embroidery equipment, how much that can run. And honestly, same thing with folks who are buying home equipment. I mean, if you guys are buying home machines, I was shocked the first time I saw, as a dyed-in-the-wool commercial machine guy and commercial embroidery guy, I was shocked the first time I saw how much some of the home style single needles run. So honestly, I'm surprised that anybody puts that kind of investment in without knowing a little bit more about who they're buying from. But at the same time, that was still present. People wanted to see it, and I will say that this specific set of sessions, more than others I've done in previous years, I was hit with questions from folks that I wasn't fully expecting, which is actually, as much as you might see somebody get caught flat-footed or have to stop and refigure what they're going to discuss, which I did certainly in my sessions. In fact, I had to change the timing of the session in Illinois because we went over with questions. But that set of questions means that I'm going to refine my work, and I'm going to give people better information that I might not have known I was missing from my presentation until people were asking. The smaller groups let people ask more, and I will say that the people who were there were certainly dedicated to learning. If I had one wish for myself for what I could have done differently or what could have been set up differently, is that I was teaching a very much intermediate to expert level course, which certainly intermediate level for sure, but it was certainly not a beginner course. This was not I think I might be interested in digitizing class. And I had people showing up for that because I was the only option. Because this is my assumption for them. They seemed to be happy when I discussed it with them. They said they were fairly happy with it. And in fact, a lot of them asked me lots of follow-up questions and said mostly they were just, their head was spinning at the end of it and they needed to process, but they would like the class. But I really would have loved to teach a beginner level course or shorter sessions where I could have done some more beginner work. And I think coming up into the next trade show season, I will certainly make the case for more beginner level, entry level embroidery, and honestly, entry level digitizing discourse, if at all possible. Because I think the fact that we were working on short schedules, I had to run with a topic that was something I could easily bring back out of my archives because we didn't have time to work up a new 4-hour workshop session. Meant that we went with a certain direction and everybody had to either come with us or not. And it meant that anyone who wasn't in that kind of intermediate track with digitizing probably got a lot of information really quickly and could have used more time. The fact that some of the questions weren't mind-blowing to me because I had to answer things I didn't expect to. We are, halfway through one of these long sessions and someone who's been sitting there while I'm talking about texture and sculptural digitizing and dealing with elements of stitches in order to create visual contrast and impact. I'm talking about this stuff that's on a fairly, I would consider a higher level, more creative level. And someone says, hey, exactly what is underlay? Could you define that specifically? And I had stopped and discussed underlay for a minute. And it just tells me that we have a wider range of people who are out there looking for answers, and that we didn't really have the assets there to fix that for them. We didn't really have everything we needed to get them settled. And I think as presenters, we were doing the best that we can because we had to kind of work with limited resources and limited time, but that was a little hard. And I think that was hard for those people this year for sure. So it is a lot. It is a lot for people to handle if they don't know that. And I think that happened across the board, where specifically the way the DAC show decided to handle things was not to have the shorter sessions. They had already done an online set of shorter seminars. And so they kept those out and only did the larger workshops. And the larger workshops meant that you had to have more engagement. So if somebody was an engaged person but wasn't ready for the large workshops, what they ended up doing is sitting through a workshop that was a bit more over their head. They got a lot out of it. Certainly, I stayed and asked questions or answered questions and have since answered questions online and directly for those folks. But it did mean that some of them really probably got a little more than they would bargain for and needed a little bit more clarification. So we'll go ahead and keep going from there. In any case, let's go ahead and grab a couple more comments before we get into more topics. I don't want to make this a part 3 mailbag. Who knows? It might be, but I'm going to try and keep kind of concise today and make this a shorter show because I know that we all have a lot going on right now. I know this is kind of a tough season for a lot of us getting going, and from some of my decorators, they're starting to get things like school opening back up and other things happening, and sports still kind of working out. That was another thing I saw, was people getting fall sports going and started. So they've been doing more work than is usual for them. Things are opening back up. So let's go ahead and talk to a few people who are in here and see some other comments and what's going on. Like I said, hopefully some of you got the notifications now. I can see we have a smaller audience than sometimes, so it's a pretty good audience. If you have questions, by all means, ask them here, and I'll try and get to what I can for sure. Marianne says, as I begin to slowly open up, I tried ordering catalogs from my vendor. Some are going virtual and no catalogs available to mail. So heads up. I got Alpha Brother ones, but only 2020. Hang on to those that you have. So yeah, that's something. Physical catalogs, apparently, that's if they're not offering physical catalogs for this year, you may want to hold on to those if that's something that you use for your shop. Like I said, lots of stuff going virtual, but I know that that's not the answer for every customer and every client. Yeah, take a look at that. And the other thing I'm going to say about stocking is the other thing we heard over and over again. If I had one other topic that came up tremendously often as we were talking this stuff as far as business goes, blank stock. We've been having a lot of problems with our chain of stock for sure. We're having a lot of trouble getting in supplies as we usually would. I will say this though, it should be an opportunity for us to some degree to look at the product lines that are available out there and find what's possible. This, of all times, if there was ever a good time not to just flop a catalog in front of your customer and say, pick what you can or pick what you want, this is the best time ever to curate your selection. Look at stock before customers come in so you have answers for them. Keep aware of some basic staples and what's available as best you can, and lead with things that you have a better chance of the stock chain being complete, where you can actually get the stuff that's there. Absolutely, you're still going to run into problems, but this is something like, and funny enough, I usually deal with this in a technical fashion. People will come to me with problems with hats, and they're consistently having the same problems with the same kind of hats. And when I'm looking at the kind of hats that they're dealing with, yes, they are desirable hat brands sometimes, but often enough, they aren't necessarily the only brand in their category that looks like the hat that they're showing me. And I recommend that they look through the kind of hats they're running to see if there's anything in the class that they can test and find one that runs better for them, because some hats are just the worst for running, and they have support materials in them that cause needle deflection, that can cause roughness in the design. And those issues are endemic to that kind of hat sometimes, and especially if you're doing work that doesn't stand up well to that kind of abuse, it would be really good or a great idea to have some hats that run well and offer those as your best option to your customers. Start with those and have categories of that kind of laid out for yourself. Curate your collection as best you can. Flopping a catalog in front of somebody and just saying pick whatever you want, especially in a time where stock is low, it's a good time to start laying out reasonable expectations with clients now before we get things underway. Doesn't mean you're not going to run into trouble. Doesn't mean you're not going to have issues. There are stock shortages all over the place. However, it does help to at least let people know the issues exist, and as best as you can, start from a place where you're curating work. You're curating the kind of garments you offer so that they are technically good for you and they have the best chance of being in stock that you can offer. I mean, honestly, we are somewhat at the whims of these stock problems. At the same time, though, sincerely, everybody, there are just possibilities for us to make this as best it can be by being clear with our customers in the first place, and by curating our selection and offering things that have the best chance of being in and being good for us to run. So it's just like showing the work you want to do. And I talk to digitizers and artists in general, and they're showing work that is painful for them, not profitable for them, or honestly, they don't really like, but it's impressive in some fashion. The most of the work that you have in front of everybody in social media and otherwise should be the kind of work you want to continue to do if you're doing this in a business fashion. You should show those showpieces, be clear about them being more costly or more time intensive than your other work, but then show the kind of work that you want to continue doing that you think is most profitable, most advantageous to you. Same thing here with stock. Show the stock that's in first. Sell the stock that's in as best you can. Lead with intention on the stuff that you're doing as far as dealing with your clients. So once again, another thing from the trade shows to learn: yes, stock problems are real. I'm not saying they're not real or that you aren't going to have problems with stock or people wanting to order something that was in existence last year and isn't now. However, the best way to arm ourselves against this isn't by going, man, I hate the vendors. They just suck. Man, I hate shipping. It just sucks. The best way to arm ourselves with our clients and with anyone we're dealing with is to stop and before this becomes an issue, say, here are the options I know that are the most likely to work out. I can't promise you anything because we're having these issues. These are the things that are in stock right now, and I'd like to show them to you, because one of the things people forget is that even though a client may come to us and ask for something, it may be that their delivery date or having all the garments be exactly the same or something else is more important to them than the garment they selected. We have to make sure we advance that conversation and say, hey, what's the most important to you? I can get things if it's later. I can get them if there's more cost, but I can also give you this for this cost or this right now. And that includes things that you might have in dead stock. If your business has been running for a while and you have dead stock, start offering your dead stock now, because you never know who might be accepting of it. I was always shocked by that. But a couple more things I want to bring up. First, couple comments. By the way, Mr. Xtish himself, thank you for showing up, even for a minute to say hi. By the way, I would love to do some more stuff on the site at some point. I might need to talk to you real quick. It'd be a good time to do a new article sometime soon. But Jamie Chalmers, awesome guy. And by the way, congrats on the first day of school for the little one. And hope she's doing well. And hope you're doing well too, sir. So thank you for the celebrity pop-in, Mr. X. Okay, we have a couple other people who are on right now. Josta's on from Sweden. Hi, Josta. Happy to have you in here. And let's see, have a couple more people. This is about the actual people who are in the class. Ramona was also in my class at DAX in Illinois. So Chicagoland DAX, Ramona was there. And yes, I did indeed. I told you guys, I did remove my mask and go step back up to the front. I did ask first to make sure people were okay with it. And I stayed in the front of the class, many feet away from everybody. I will say and this is the reason why I did it primarily. And Joe Rita brings it up for accessibility. This is what's kind of hard because I didn't have a good option for this at the time. Joe Rita does a lot of lip reading, and I realized that we were going to have some issues with people being able to hear me in a non-mic'd up space. What I would say going forward, I think I'm going to make sure that I have the ability to be mic'd up because it's a little safer to be able to do that, and then I can leave the mask on as much as I can. As we're going into this, once again, fully vaccinated and great, but I could not vouch for everyone's status and I wasn't checking cards at the door. So it is something to think about. Think about what you feel comfortable with your safety. And certainly, like I said, shows going forward, it looks like we're all going to be masked up outside of status. All of the inside spaces are now said to be, masked up. This is what's going to happen. We're going to be doing distancing, but you do have to know for sure, folks, that it is still going on. People are going to be uneven in their application of this, especially in states where it's not entirely de rigueur for everybody to wear the mask all the time, for sure. But let's talk a little bit more about some other topics we have in here. Letty says, I think you need that beginner level because there are people moving from the home and hobby side into a business side, and it is a leap. Yeah, indeed. And I'll also say this, Letty, I think there were people who were coming to feel things out, who wanted that personal attention at the trade show to say, hey, I think I might want to digitize. I think I might want to do embroidery. And the only options we had were 3.5 hour sessions. And by the way, cheers to the people who stayed through the 3.5 hour session and asked questions after, despite the fact they had no knowledge to start from. You folks are soldiers. You absolutely carried on through all of that stuff. You are monsters. I can't believe you took that on. However, what I am going to say for everybody is that those who did probably got the most personal attention out of everyone, because I know I certainly felt it. There was a couple people this year who came up to me after that 3.5 hour class and said, literally, they're like, so I was thinking about digitizing, and I looked at them like, are you okay? You just took 3.5 hours of as fast as I talk and as much as I can give you. Now, don't get me wrong. We had breaks, but a couple of 10-minute breaks are not going to stop 3.5 hours of the kind of speed and content that you guys have come to recognize that I'll give you in the Takeup. Imagine that with slides, with technical information, and more directed toward a topic. It's a fire hose, and I'm not going to lie. I know it's a fire hose. It's why you all guys also get a handout from me that's the size of an ebook, because essentially I know I'm going to give you a lot of information. I want you to process it over time, and I'm hopeful that it will spur you to look at things yourself that are different, or that to get into further research on the topic. It's why I always offer a lot of Q&A at the end. It's why I'll stay as long as I need to. what I find is people actually absorb small amounts of it. But sometimes I think opening up the fire hose and letting it get in, what I have heard from people is that they get inspired and then they go back and research the stuff that they were really interested in the entire thing. If I can turn on a few light switches for everybody, things that really make you think differently, that's what I'm looking for. One of the big ones is people getting really excited about a few things in this session. Number one, I defined sculpture and tried to explain how bas relief, so very flat, low relief sculpture, is like embroidery and what we can do. And also that though I stress single color embroidery a lot when I'm talking about this, that we use the single color, the relief structure, so broken up individual elements and carving in our digitizing in a single color, we use that single color as a basis for shading and working on top of. So even though we're going to shade or use multiple colors, we can still use stitch type, stitch angles, and directionality and contrast between blocks that are touching each other to make a base on top of which we can add color, shading, and other detail. So I think that's something that was new to me, is realizing people weren't catching that and then getting into that more in these sessions. Also, at the end of this session, I did a very, very short section where I talked about inspiration and how we mix things up or how we remix and how we can take lots of inspiration, boil it down, work through it, and then end up with new non-infringing things from the retail research we do by looking at other people's work and looking at the kind of work that's out there, both, on the high street, in fashion, and in the art scene. And we can look at that work and take elements from it and either remix, mash up, or come up with new things without just biting somebody's style or stealing, honestly, because that's the thing. Whenever I talk about retail research, I'll have somebody who goes, that's what thieves do. That's what you do if you're doing knockoffs. And I actually did a small section on inspiration as part of that. How do we take inspiration and boil it down? And what are the kind of processes that I like to use? And it's something that I'm going to be expanding on, because I found that I had a couple of people contact me after the fact and say, that's what blew my mind for sure. That's something that got me interested, is that I didn't know how to, or I didn't have a direct method for taking things that inspired me and making something new without knocking it off. And there's nothing wrong with doing copies of things for your own work when you're just working on technique, but it is really interesting to go out and take a look at what's out there and then boil it down. This is what I always say: consume broadly, create with focus. What I mean by that is look at everything and take little bits of inspiration, but then we mix those into something new. We don't remake something that's out there when we're making our own work. We make something new that has elements of the thing that inspired us. And I think that was something that was interesting to discuss. So cool stuff there. By the way, Mr. X Stitch says, my door is open, so I think I got to do some new posts, man. Once I get through this next trade show, like I said, guys, at the end of about middle of the week after next, because it's starting at the end of next week. When I finish up Fort Worth, I think I'm going to be a better person here. I'll be a better contributor and have more to give you guys online, social media, and in the article space. I've still been writing articles through all this. Images Magazine every month has articles from me, but I think I'll be a better contributor after I get through this little trade show season. Because I'll say having my seasons shifted and having to compress my development schedule for classes has been really hard. And if you add to that all the weird stuff, you guys know that all the house drama that I had with it not having hot water in the house and having things torn up. And also we had that water issue. Same thing all happened during pandemic, where I had to have my slab in my house torn up twice and, have plumbers in the house and all this other stuff. We're finally coming to a point where things will hit some equilibrium. And once the trade shows are done, I can get a little more focused on getting you guys more content out. So maybe me and Mr. X might be a time to bring the ghost in the embroidery machine back. It's time for that. But let's bring you a couple more things, because one of the other things that I wanted to talk about as a topic actually had to do with this too. I realized that people weren't fully kind of grokking, not fully getting down to the bone, the concept of drawing and throwaway drawings, throwaway objects in digitizing as a means for helping you guide yourself. And it's something I'm going to discuss here too. But yeah, in general, one of the things that you cannot get rid of from trade shows is the sense of community. It's like a symposium. Everyone is around. We're all talking. We all present points. And everyone brings their own background to this show, to this party. They bring their own background. They also bring their own specialties. People have different specialties. You have one person who does upholstery. Everybody does shirts. Everybody does hats to some degree. But you'll have someone who does car upholstery, someone who does medieval replicas, which happened to me this time out, someone who does home style work. We have Joe Rita, who comes and shows us these awesome landscapes. We're going to have someone who does monogramming primarily. We bring all these people together and we see different materials that they use. We see different processes that they use. They have different questions and different focuses, both for their business and for the digitizing side, for the embroidery side. And we have all of these tips come together, and that really works. Really works. So it helps a lot. I just thought that's something I wanted to say. That inspiration, getting people together, is fantastic. And by the way, one more comment for Jorita. I know Jorita has to head out, but she said this: I sure like to see your items in person. Better to get a look at the layers and stitches better than the web. Yeah, and this is the thing. As people often know, I mentioned this. My wife always asks me, why am I carrying? Because I carry 2 huge bags of samples with me. I walk through all the airports. One of them comes with me on the planes. Got a big backpack full of sample kit stuff on one shoulder with my bag that has all my stuff for doing my presentation. All that gets hauled with me everywhere. And to my own great risk that I'm sure I'll be sad about one day, I put all of my hat samples in my checked luggage, and I bring those with too, so that people can see hats and flats always. Often the same samples. Some of them are greatest hits that go with me to every show, but seeing them in person helps people visualize what I mean when I'm talking about these stitch types, when I'm talking about carving, when I'm talking about detail and density and all of these things. And honestly, looking at someone else's work is something that's inspiring. Looking at other needle arts, looking at machine embroidery, number one, looking number two at any kind of needle arts, textiles, and ways that people use thread for mark making can be inspiring. But holding someone else's samples in their hand gives you an idea of what they're talking about. And on top of it, it spurs new questions. It spurs questions. Someone can pick something up and go, that is interesting. How did you do that? They will look at, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes it's horrifying to me because they'll look at a piece that's got too much stabilizer, because I've got a lot of stuff that's from my operators. Sometimes they did stuff that I didn't love, but I liked the sample and I wanted to bring it out to show a stitch type. I'll have somebody flip my stuff just like I did everybody else, flip it over and go, man, that's a lot of stabilizer. What about that? And I have to discuss it. But those questions bring up more things that we can all get together on and bring our unique viewpoints to. And that's where trade shows excel. Holding things in your hand, we are still in not only a very visual, but a very tactile kind of industry here. Wearing garments that go on a person. That is primarily what we do, is apparel. Apparel is the largest part of what you see us doing out here. I'm not saying everybody's apparel. Like I said, upholstery is a really great one too, but I think even touching and looking at upholstery is a thing, because when I discuss embroidery, when I discuss carving and all this dimension, one of the biggest things I'm discussing is the fact that the play of light across the surface is what makes embroidery more valuable. And how are we going to see light move across the surface unless we are either holding an item or watching it in video, and then we can't really control it. So being able to literally hold and roll an item back and forth in your hands so you can see how light plays on the stitches is critical to understanding why we choose certain stitch types, stitch angles, and certain parameters for our stitches to get certain looks in embroidery. It is really critical. There's other ways we can do that. Certainly, if everyone's got embroidery machines, we can send files out. They can run them themselves. They can take a look at them. There are ways we can remedy that kind of issue, but there is nothing quite as immediate as the feedback from trade shows. So in doing a review of the trade shows, I know we're like 50 minutes into this, and the chances are I won't get to all the topics we wanted to talk about today. In reviewing the trade shows, though, that's kind of that is what there is in a nutshell. There is still value to the trade show. I see myself doing more online education in the coming year, and I think that you're going to see shows continuing to do hybrid education as well as online education, sometimes to the detriment, or at least to the exclusion of other types of education to some degree, just because it doesn't have the same kind of risks, and I get that. But if I'm trying to predict what I want to see, or if I'm trying to project what I want to see in the future, I wouldn't take trade shows off of the line yet. What I'd say is I think we do need to revise them. We need to make them more valuable for everybody and think about what they are here for. If they move to being more experiential and more focused on the education, then we need to know that and start to work toward that. And I think, like I said, for the people who showed up, even though the vendor contingent wasn't quite as big, they got a lot of attention, and we should be thinking about rewarding the people that gave us that kind of attention and rewarding I would say also the people who are doing education in person, because it is valuable for some folks. Just making sure that that is, not only that we reward people when we support them, because I also got education out at the shows. I go to see people and meet people in person, but making sure that we kind of make that clear and help to shape what we want to see. But then we need to, be there when it comes time, or at the very least provide as much support as we can in the ways that we can if we want to keep seeing it there. But yeah, super valuable still. I found that the interaction, the immediacy of the interaction is still very valuable. I definitely see more online education happening, but I think we're going to have to find ways around some of it. Most of the ways around the physicality of this thing that I know are going to take a lot of input from both sides and probably a lot of more effort from both sides. I mean, if we're talking about either shipping samples around everywhere or having people run things individually themselves, it's going to take more commitment than I think this does. And certainly we'll have to discuss what that looks like. But I think all of us who are out there and doing education, hey, Embroidery Nerd, we've got Jeff here from Embroidery Nerd as well as Justin. They're doing a lot too. It's not that online education is anything new. I've been doing it. We've all been doing it. But I think we're out here now figuring out what this looks like to do both and how to make it valuable for everybody. I think increased access is great for people who are seeing more education online than they ever have. But I think that there's still a place for in-person education. And hopefully we get to a point where we're reaching equilibrium. Everybody's a lot safer and we don't have to worry about it the way we did now. But if you're trying to ask me, which some of the questions were, are people going to trade shows? Yes. Are they entirely safe? Hey, there's risk in everything. Some people aren't following all the rules, and that's just going to be the case if you want to go out. Are they still going on? Absolutely. And is there still more to do? Yes, there is. And like I said, you're going to see us out at Fort Worth being as safe as we can, but getting out there and having those interactions that make trade shows and make, honestly, getting together so great. So that's what's going on there. But I've got a couple more comments I wanted to bring in as well. Number one, Ramona saying, I wanted to mention in class that your scuba man is what motivated me to create and use carving. I'll actually bring that up because I have that on screen here, I believe. So let me go ahead and share. I can share my screen again. I have Dax up there, but let me see if I've got Scuba Man. And this is one of the ones I talked about. This is something that helped motivate Ramona to create and use carving. And when we talk about carving, what I mean by carving, as usual, is taking an object. If you see on the left-hand side, we have the scuba diver. Is it recognizable as a scuba diver? This is how the original art came and what the original piece was made for this company that I did this work for. They brought me what was on the left, which is somebody ran it through auto digitizing. And as you can see, it looks pretty rough. And I would say there's some unfortunate looking projections coming off of this guy. You can't really see everything that's supposed to be there. And it looks kind of blobby. There's not a lot of definition to it. Can we see the scuba guy? Sure, but it's pretty flat. In the center is what I finally made, and I used some reference to draw what's on the right-hand side, which these are throwaway lines I actually drew in my digitizing software. This is the thing I had to explain a little bit better this time around, but the lines that I drew were here just as a way for me to think visually about what was on screen and help me see what's going on. You can see that those lines on the right-hand side, the lines that are in magenta or pink, depending on how your screen is rendering those lines I drew with a straight stitch tool. But then I locked all those down and eventually I threw away all those straight stitches. These were not stitches that were ever going to sew. These were lines that no one was ever going to look at. And I was using them to help me figure out where to define the different shapes. Carving in this case means taking what is maybe one shape in your art, like we have here on the left-hand side, this super flat scuba guy, and instead rendering it in multiple embroidery shapes, embroidery objects, in different stitch types. So we have contrast between stitch types. We have contrast between different angles in the same stitch type. And we have individual unique objects that are made for embroidery to use embroidery to its best effect dimensionally. In this case, it's single color, but absolutely there. This is absolutely the way that I handled it. It's not perfect, but it did make a big difference to the client. The client really loved these things. Like I said, anytime I use dimensional carving like this, I always hear, oh, look at his little X, whatever it is. Look at the little mask. Look at the little dive watch. Look at the little face. Whatever it is that I've used dimensional carving on, this detail has a tendency to delight people. It makes people happy. They see it and they see that you took care with their logo and that you have some inspiration, that you do have some creativity behind it. And handling it like this, like I said, in my entire career, 20 years of doing this, I've had maybe, I'll say this, sub 10 people, and I think it's literally less than 5, right? I think it's literally less than 5 people who have said, I'd rather have the flat rendering. I remember one very distinctly because it's the only one who was ever upset. because they thought that I had tried to they took exception with me altering their logo, but that's literally out of decades of work. Did I have anybody not like this dimensional version? But the thing that I wanted to talk about this for sure is that in drawing, there's a kind of drawing that is drawing for thinking visually. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate, I don't think we all have to be artists, but I think that drawing a little bit, using your kind of visual skills, using some drawing skills, and it doesn't have to be good, it doesn't have to be perfect. As you can see on the right-hand side, I'm getting some critical comments too here. On the right-hand side, you can see that I drew a few lines, and it was like 5 minutes of playing around with lines, and I didn't even draw all the lines I needed in order just to figure out where you're going to put objects for stitching, because the objects that are in front of you in the art are infrequently the ones you need for embroidery. Why is this? Often we have to change objects. We have to change shapes of things because of pull and push compensation. We know stitches are going to get shorter. Stacks of stitches are going to get longer or taller. They're going to stack up and move out. So we have a eye in satin stitch, a vertical column. It's going to get narrower and taller. That is push and pull distortion. It happens all the time, every time. So we're going to have to change. If you wanted the eye to be a certain shape, you're going to have to draw it wider and shorter than the real thing. We already know we have to change things for distortion. The second thing to realize is, okay, we change things for distortion. Why don't we also change them so that we make the best use of embroidery itself? We make the best use of the nature of embroidery, which is its physicality, that we make use of the shine, that we make use of the way light plays across the surfaces. And that's what I'm talking about here. But part of the way we do that is by drawing, is by using our minds, thinking ahead of time. We can see shapes that a computer will not see when it's just looking at edges. If you look at that left-hand side, the computer doesn't know that's a diver. It knows what the distance is between two sides of the shape. It can find maybe if their shape was clean and clear enough, it might be able to auto-digitize a portion of it in as much as it knows if an object is about this wide, it's about this long, that's a good candidate for satin stitch. If it gets any wider than that, I'm going to make it into a fill. It can do that. But when it starts to try and figure out which leg is on top of the other, what that tube is off the front of this person's face, it doesn't even know it's a tube. It knows I have a thin object with a hole in it. This is now a complex fill because that's all I know what to do with an object with holes in it. Or I have to break off and make this a new piece of satin, maybe, if it's dealing with the fact that it's trying to branch something out. It doesn't really see it. And I think that's something that helps people understand a little bit. Showing something like this, the thing that got me to think differently is I'm going to start talking to people about what we can do after this. This is a single color version, but even if I were doing a multicolor scuba diver, let's say that most of these were pieces of this piece were done in like black to represent black neoprene. If I wanted to shade some highlights in gray on top of this piece, or if all these different elements, belts and straps were in different colors, it would still look better if I thought of these with carving. So I thought about the directionality of my stitches. I thought about satin stitches being shiny, fill stitches being rougher, curved stitches showing volume and making things look like they're curved into space. Even if I'm going to use shading on top of it, even if I'm going to outline things, even if I'm going to use multiple colors, thinking about the shapes that we have there and carving out of those shapes is still important and still something to discuss. Thinking about also, even if you were using all this as a single color, but now I'm going to outline on top, it still looks better if I carve it up than if I use just this super flat version. Now, certainly in this case, on the left, it looks like a total blob and it would be improved a great deal. Even if you left this as fill stitch, it'd be improved a great deal by defining all the edges of the objects, drawing on top of it and having it look like a sketch, having outlines that show what all these different objects are to help you find your edges. It would look more defined, but I think it would look even better if I did that and I did the carving. And that's something I don't always talk about. But but let's talk about a couple. We have a couple comments that are funny in here. Might as well have these up. Ramona says, going back to Scuba Man, you need to round up his butt a bit. It's a little bit full baby diaper looking. Yeah, I know it's a little funny. It's because of the garments that are on there. It's not supposed to look like that, but yeah. Jeff says, no, he's wearing pants. Yeah, like I said, this looks a little super high shiny. The software that I was using when I made this original preview, and I probably need to redo it, has a super high shine and shadow, the way they render their 3D stitches, and it does make it look a little funky. But yeah, I'll take it under advisement that he's got a funky looking butt on that particular piece. It doesn't look quite that much in the actual piece, but yeah. And also, Jeff, by the way, from an earlier comment, and I'll go ahead and pop down the examples for this. Talking about retail research, a bit different kind of retail research. Jeff says, when I worked at Walmart, they actually sent managers to other stores to do competitive pricing. See, and this is the thing, I don't like that for pricing, even though I think it's good to know where you're at in pricing. Pricing as a function of averaging and then dropping your price under the closest 5 stores to you is a great way to end up racing to the bottom. But I do believe that Walmart probably does do competitive pricing. I'll say this though, there's nothing wrong with looking at what else is out there in the industry and in the market. If your competitors don't keep up with, especially you're talking about like the quality and style that you do, if they can't keep up with your innovation on that case, that's up to them. That's up to their clients. But I will say that retail research for me, it's always been about shortening the cycle between what's going on in retail and what's going on in our space. And I'll say that when I first started out in embroidery, largely garment styles, stuff like that took months, sometimes an entire season or an entire year. Like you would see something cool in retail, and by the time you actually got a garment that looked like that garment, you would be in the next year at the same season. Like if it's spring 2021 and you see something cool, well, you'll see that as a blank that you can purchase spring 2022. Back in the day, that is how it used to be. These days, the cycle between something being popular in the commercial or in the retail space and you having access to it is much shorter. And I'll say this definitely when we're talking about decoration styles. If you see something cool in retail or streetwear, someone will ask you for that style shortly. It will be months, if not weeks, before someone comes in and says, I saw something on the Superdry website. Can you make merch like that? Because people are much more design conscious and much more aware of style and fashion than they used to be. Don't get me wrong, Joe's Plumbing may ask for the same left chest from here until, the end of time. But the chances are, or at least it was for me the case, that more and more people throughout my career have come to me with fashion forward examples, streetwear examples, retail examples, and said, yes, I have my business logo. Can you do something like this? Can you reproduce this? And certainly it came down to materials, multimedia, stuff like that. The cycle was much shorter and is still getting shorter. So retail research in this case for me is just being aware of stuff, being aware of the finishes that are out there, being aware of the materials that are out there, and also to a degree trying to anticipate to some degree at least that if you're looking into retail spaces and let's say you're seeing a certain technique really pop off, thick thread. Thick fuzzy thread is everywhere. It's in all these logos and they're using vintage styles for everything. Be aware of what that is. Know where you would get some if you needed to, because the chances are if it's in the mall, you'll be hearing about it in a couple months. It's not as much as it used to be right this very second, because I think that people have been changing up a little bit of what they think about these things. But even in the case of people being more concerned about sourcing and stuff like that, we are still seeing people being fashion forward, thinking about merch, thinking about branding more than ever. As each of us, myself included, become our own little TV stations, our own little promotional engines, marketing engines, more of us are thinking about merchandising, more of us are thinking about products, more of us are thinking about branding. And that extends beyond the space of people who do decoration, who are serving and servicing this branding industry. More and more people are running a podcast and have merch, have garments, have apparel, have pins and patches and printed stuff and sticker sheets. More and more people know about hiring a designer, hiring an artist to make content for them. It is not going to a place where we're having less of that. We're having more of that, more customization, more people aware of an idea of seasons or brand lines or different ideas or coordinating examples happening over and over and over again. So do think about that for sure. Howard says, scuba diver was definitely a great example to help me as well. Thank you, Howard. Glad to hear that. Like I said, very simple example, but I use that to show more complex stuff. And maybe I'll get into some more of the carving and stitch type stuff here shortly. I think we can do some more complex work and discuss and maybe do some design breakdown. One of the concepts that we had earlier on that people thought they would really like to see is me taking some more of the examples from my career and warts and all, including not hiding the fact that I wasn't always the digitizer I was when I finished or that I am now, and doing some design reworks and taking a look at things and refreshes and analyzing. So bringing some designs in, showing you original art, the real design, and discussing it. And we'll see if we can do some of that. I think there's enough corporate stuff there that wouldn't cause any kerfuffle to bring that up, and some other personal stuff I can do. So maybe we'll do some more complicated stuff and just do some more breakdowns as we get going here. And I do agree with you, Jeff, on this one. Joe's Plumbing will ask for the same left chest until Joe retires. You would think so. The other thing I have, though, now, if you haven't had one of these customers yet, and maybe you still will, part of my chair's kind of sliding down here. Maybe you've already had this client, the super design client, where they come in and they're like, nope, new year, I'm doing new garments, I'm doing new uniforms, everything has got to be different. Here's the couple of design pieces I'm looking at. Here's this shirt that I saw from whatever streetwear brand, whatever skate brand. I want to make this type and this type and this type. And they have a new line of stuff every year. Funny enough, some of the ones I did that were surprising to me were we had a couple towing companies who were like that, new styles all the time, a couple mechanics who were like that, new styles all the time. It really just depends on who you're talking about, but there are these certain customers where it's like, no, I want to be on the new thing. I'm going to do something cool, and we do something new every year. And those people are definitely different. Becky Jean says, do you have an online class for patch making? I have an online class that talks about digitize for patches, but it's mostly manual and cross-platform, because you're saying, does it have it just merely in Brilliance? I wouldn't say merely, but I do have, most of my stuff is cross-platform. Check back with me. We might have to do something in the official and Brilliance channels that's separate, that's not that. But I do have a class. If you want to take a class that has general construction of emblems, it does also discuss things like Merrily or like Jeff's edges, where there's faux Merrow edges. It does discuss that, but the class mostly is about different methods of patch making, discussing how we put together edges, stuff like that. There is a class called oh, I see this. You're right. Jeff says, I believe she meant Merrily. I thought you meant only in Brilliance or in Brilliance by itself. I don't have a Merrily class. No, I do not. I don't have a Merrily class, but we will have to look into doing something specific. If you want to just know about more different ways of making patches, I do have a class called Understanding Emblems that's out there from decorators.education. That's something we have in the links list, I believe, as well. There is a class out there, and that's a long class, but it also has about some content about selling patches, about designing patches, and about how they're used as far as part of a product line. But they do have manual creation of borders and the different methods of execution. But you're right. And Jeff says, Eric's TED Talk, I highly recommend it. Well, thank you, Jeff. I liked it. It was a good session. It was long. It was, once again, three breakouts over the course of like 4 hours. We had different sections that were there to help you kind of conceptualize patches, understand where they fit into your product line, and then actually bring them to fruition. But in that, it was not a Merrily specific class. In fact, it wasn't digitizing specific to any one software, because this was something done for Decorators Education. But we may have to make some content for Merrily, but that's in the Brilliance side of the world, and that may be something different that comes up. But yeah, keep checking in on that, especially in the social media over there. We may have something more going on there, but certainly if you want to know more about patch making in general, and you want to know more about how to build a set of borders, and also about the different styles of small run patch making, from like water soluble substrates to plastic substrate to hot cut, whichever type you want to do, that class has more to do with that. And that's available as a recording now, though that is a paid recording, and that's over at decorators.education. So that's something that if you do get interested in that, here it is, decorators.education/emblems. I actually still have that set up as a banner. It is available now as a recording if you want a longer session on patches that goes through just about everything about small run patches that you might want to get into. But that's there as well. But yeah, something to check into. But thank you, by the way. Lori says, I still rewatch that emblems class often. I'm glad it has some rewatchability there. Like I said, I put out a lot of information, but I hope you get to it a little at a time as you have time, and learn things as you go. That's why I'm happy to have them recorded after the lives, for sure. Let's talk about a couple more things we want to discuss. Like I said, I don't think we're going to get to everything to make up the mailbag, but there were a couple little things that I wanted to talk about briefly. First of all, was that kind of visual thinking, the visual aspect, the drawing as thinking on paper, figuring things out in that way. And that's something that came out a lot in my classes, so I wanted to make sure we discussed it really quickly. And one of the things to make sure I clarify about that is that when I talk about drawing throwaway shapes, that throwaway is the important word there. Whatever method you use, and any method is valid, I think it is valuable for us to draw lines to help us demarcate, to help us show the edges of the shapes we're eventually going to digitize. If you're looking at this thing on the left-hand side and you don't quite know what's going on here in the wrist and the arm, you don't know where the shoulder is, stopping to draw a line to go, this is where I want the shoulder and the elbow to be, and just messing around with it means that when I go to digitize, I'm going to say, okay, the body is here and the arm is here. I know I want that arm to be a satin stitch. I can draw my shape which includes me having to have overlap because of, pull and push compensation in under this arm, it lets me know that I'm going to draw that shape that way. And it's going to help me to define that when I go to digitize. So doing some prefiguring, some work, whether you do it in your digitizing software, you print something out and draw on top of it, or you do it in vector software, doesn't matter. What matters is taking a little bit of time to think on the paper, to think in the plane of the picture and say, I'm going to draw some lines to help me find where I'm going. Because we all know that the idea about guidelines for laying text or something else where you just drag a guideline out from a ruler, and straight guidelines are awesome. These are guidelines for shape. And it's something you can do just to help yourself have a note there, have an idea there for where the edges of a shape will be when you digitize your actual objects. They are throwaway shapes. Once you're done with them, you grab them, you toss them. If there's actual stitch shapes like this, they are used where I used a straight stitch tool to draw them. You grab them all and throw them away. If you have a software that has capable vector tools inside of it and you are feel comfortable using them, you can use those and throw them away. One of the reasons why I originally did this with straight stitches is that the software I was using didn't use vector style inputs, and the inputs that people, or the people who were digitizing, weren't comfortable with vector style inputs either. And so for them, using spline style inputs where you just keep drawing, like let's say you want a curve, you just keep drawing curved nodes and you add more until it fits the curve you want. That spline style of drawing is very easy for some folks. So I intended to make this as easy as possible because I don't think of this as art prep, because I don't think of this as something anyone's ever going to see. I encourage people to use that straight stitch tool because they were using spline input. They were using that easier input than Bezier curves where you don't have to draw that drag with handles. If you're someone who's comfortable in vector software, you might do this all in vector software and prep your art before it gets into the embroidery software, and that's fine. Or if you have software like Stitch Artist has essentially vector tools, if you're comfortable with that, or it has spline input on vector lines so that I don't have to use straight stitches. The reason I used stitches back in the day is because the original software I used when I first developed this technique didn't have vector lines that were easy to drop. And even when they did, it was easier for me to see also. Depends on what you're working on. It was easier for me to see my lines if I could turn them into 3D projections of stitches. I could see them and it would make more sense. They were easier to visualize on my piece while I was working. At the time, that's what the tools needed. It's not all what we need now. It really depends on your software. If your software doesn't has nice spline entry for lines and it's easier for you to draw like that, awesome. If you're comfortable with vector, you can use any sort of tool to make this happen. Or if you are comfortable with a pencil, you can print out your art and sketch on top of it. Print it out at a lighter version of it, gray it out, 50% kind of density to that. Print it out, draw on top of it, scan it back in its size, and that works. And to that end, I wanted to show you a couple different things. Couple things that are up here. First, this is actually from Von Glitchko, who's a designer. This is someone who actually is making art for design. So it is a very different process. But just to show you, even someone who is a very professional designer who makes the cleanest vectors I have ever seen in my life, this is how he draws shading. He makes all of his line artwork first, then he brings his stuff out, he prints it out on paper and sketches in his shadows and plays with them until he's happy with the shapes, and then scans it all back in to do the rest of his vector work. I'm not saying this is what I would do, and it's not what I do at all. What I'm saying is any method by which you can think on the page, think in the art, and clarify what you want to draw is a valid method, and this is something being used by a professional day in, day out. So whatever tool you use that works for you, that works. And to that end, I showed this before. This is something that you can do. I was working with a text piece, and mostly I did this for pathing. When I tell people they have problems with pathing, which is deciding where the beginnings and ends of things are and how to logically move through a design so there's not a lot of trimming, one of the ways you can do that is by coloring your design with a pencil and not lifting the point. It helps you to figure out where you need to go without jumping, without trimming. But the other thing you can do is what I'm actually showing here. If you look at that little piece, that little wing shape that's there, it's in a single color. You can see that I've decided to break the individual parts of the winglet down there into these satin stitches that overlap. And on this drawing, I have drawn the edges of my satin stitches. I've drawn my travel stitch paths, and I've shaded these pieces with the stitch angles that I intend to use. Is it perfect? No. Is it something that I would do all the time? Also, definitely not. And in fact, now I would probably never do this. It would really take a very complicated piece of art or something that it really bothered me that needed to be fixed before I would probably be doing this amount of sketching. But if you're new to digitizing, or if you're new to dimensional carving, or you're trying to figure something out and it's just not clicking for you, there is no problem with printing something out and drawing on it if that helps for you. Or you can do, like I said before, you do like I did the scuba guy, draw a couple lines on there with whatever vector tool you have, whatever line drawing is in your digitizing software, or if your software only has stitch entry, draw it with straight stitches in a color that you'll never have in that design. And when you get ready to drop this design in for actual running, select all of that color and throw away all those stitches and save a new file off that has your final clean version. So drawing is just thinking on the page. It's thinking in the picture visually. It doesn't have to mean that we're doing art that everyone's going to use or see, and it definitely doesn't mean it's going to be in the actual embroidery. So that's when I talk about drawing throwaway lines, that's the thing I wanted to talk about. So yeah, pathing is one of those things. The other thing I wanted to show you in that range too, whenever I talk to somebody about how you draw to get a certain kind of shape, the truth of the matter is, however you get the shape matters. It matters less how you draw it than it does what you end up with. And there are multiple kinds of input that will end up with the same output. It doesn't mean that they're all equally valid. What it means is that the stitch is the thing. The embroidery is the thing. How we do our entry is less important than that, aside from the fact that how we do our entry may change what our software lets us do with a particular shape. But this is the thing. And when I enter an L, and here's a normal satin stitch L that has these stitch angles set to it. If you look at the numbers here, it's the order of entry. If I'm using a pen style tool, I'm going to be going around one direction until I finish. Starting here in this corner, down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, around the shape. That's a pen style input or a vector style input. If I'm using two-sided input, you'll see that I'll go from one side to the other side of the column each time, and it's going to connect those lines. Or there are people who, even on a satin stitch letter like this, might try a uniform pen style input, like a border style input, and it would technically make the same stitches. If we're looking at these stitches here, the actual input, and these are the real generation from the software I was using at the time. The pen and the column look very similar, but were entered differently. As you see, either I was entering around in a circle or I was entering side by side. But if you look at the uniform entry, this is done with a border tool. Yes, you can do it. I don't recommend it at all because then I can't do nearly as much with the piece. I can't do as much with those lines that are there. But if you had a uniform line width, which this particular letter does have a completely uniform line width, the column is completely uniform, these same set of stitches, very similarly, could be drawn with a center line. Do I recommend that? No. On a shape like this, where I've got two sides here and I might want to change one side differently than the other, anytime I'm actually drawing a column like this, I generally am going to want to do this unless it's a border. Unless it is a straight border that is supposed to be one thickness around an object, that's usually when I'm going to use a border line, or maybe if I'm using line details that are universal, they just have one thickness, I might draw those kind of detail lines in with a satin stitch line like this or a border tool, but you won't catch me doing it with letters. The truth of the matter is, though, what's going to come out in the actual stitch out? What's in the stitches? The stitches are the stitches are the stitches. No matter how you draw them is how you draw them. The tool you need to use is the one that makes you the most comfortable. I would say, honestly, these days I draw more with pen than I ever have because I had to certainly get used to that. It was something where originally I was doing a lot of two-sided entry, but I wanted to be able to do more vector style entry and to show folks who came from the design world, who are used to drawing pen style, which is how vectors are generally drawn. People who are coming from that cut world, that design world, were much more likely to end up using that vector style input where they're drawing around in a circle. I wanted to be able to show them that input and make it work for them better. So I use more pen style input, but column style input is equally valid. Sided left, right input is equally valid, especially when we're doing big satin stitch pieces like this for text. Very valid way to do it. The thing is, drawing is not as important as the stitches we end up with, certainly. It's about knowing which one of these shapes can operate in certain ways in your software. These days, a lot more of the software treats them all like vector lines, and it just depends on adding or removing your stitch inclinations or angles and understanding what you can do with the resulting shape that's there. So once again, those are the kind of other things we talked about with drawing. People were asking me, hey, how do you set your pull compensation? For me, I draw in my compensation for things like overlaps that need to be there so that I get good registration. But if I want to increase or decrease that, or if I want to increase that border a little bit, if I'm having issues with, say, a thicker garment that's maybe causing more pull, or I'm having just to tune it in a little bit, then I'm going to use percentages and points. But I have a tendency to draw in shapes, especially when I'm overlapping with something where it's not supposed to be seen. It's just supposed to make a junction where something's not going to be coming out of registration. It's going to be underneath another object. I'm usually going to draw that in. And then if I need to work on increasing that a little bit because I need more pull, then I'll start to use automatic settings to do that, to make that better. So settings for tuning, drawing for making your shapes what they're supposed to be. So those are the issues about drawing that I brought up. And about background building, just had a couple of elements. And like I said, I'm not going to belabor them terribly, but one of the big things, like I said, using drawing, showing people, yeah, Beziers can be used. That's all good. But drawing in this case is just thinking in the picture. All right. What I would like to bring up, though, a couple of things. We talked about background building, and mostly, by the way, here's the last little episode. This is the thing that I always show about drawing those throwaway shapes. As you can see here, I've drawn some throwaway shapes on this design in order to make up for the fact that all these areas in the back, if I would hide the stitching, you would see that there's no definition here in the back of this lion's head. This is the one that I always show in my classes. And this is where you can tell when there's absolutely nothing there. We sometimes need to draw those lines to help us figure things out. This was eventually done as overlap satin stitches in here, but you wouldn't have been able to tell that without drawing the stuff first. As far as building backgrounds, I just had a very quick couple of comments. I've taught a lot of folks that you don't want to knock out holes in everything that has embroidery behind it. If you have a background element, there's actually a full video that is in the links list, and I'll make sure that I post that again for you guys at the end here. Full video in the links list where all we did was talk about this stuff. You don't always want to knock out everything behind stitching. When we have essentially something like a single layer of satin stitch on a single layer of fill, like we have here in the Ahern text that's in the middle, the chances are you can run that on top. We're not going to have any density issues because we don't have a lot of three-dimensional density. Three-dimensional density being a lot of needle penetrations all being in the same spot. And if we keep driving the needles in the same spot, we end up building a lot of warping into our design, a lot of thickness, and we end up where we have like thread breaks, needle breaks, things like that. That's when people have that really extreme density that causes issues. One layer of satin stitch over one layer of fill is very unlikely to cause that, even at full coverage densities. However, people heard me saying if you make a complex fill, you're going to have a lot of travel stitches and issues, to mean don't ever make a complex fill with a hole in it. And that's not the case. But what I will say is many times when people are building backgrounds, I've seen them misusing a complex fill with a hole because they're getting lazy about drawing or they're not breaking things up. In this particular case here, I saw a very similar piece. I don't want to show the piece that somebody showed me, so I'm showing you this piece, which is similar out of my own catalog. It's something that I showed you guys before when talking about building backgrounds and borders. In this case, somebody built a piece like this, and the entirety of what would be this yellow background was filled in underneath the black. When we have a fill on top of a fill, that's a lot of penetrations in the same place. That's a lot of density. We need to watch that. It's not that you can't ever put fill on top of fill, but that's where you're more likely to have issues where we have a bunch of stitch penetrations inside of that fill that are more frequent than we have inside of like a big satin stitch like this, where there's no stitch penetrations down the center of the column. In this case, that's where I'm saying you need to cut out areas. That's where you're going to have issues for sure. So that's something I want to look at and say, folks, that's where you want to cut out elements. But in this case here, yes, I know this yellow looks like it's one element, but we have distinct breaks where they're not touching. In this case, I have 4 objects that I'm drawing to make these yellow shapes. And I'll play through them real quick so you can just see them. But very obviously, I have these 4 objects. I'm not going to get a bunch of excessive travel in the underlay because it's only going to underlay one of the 4 objects at a time. And you're not going to see a lot of excess density or traveling back and forth all over the place because of that breakage of the pieces. I have distinct areas right here where the yellow is completely covered and gone. I don't want to just cut away as much as I can and leave a hole in that, because the software is going to try and see that as one shape and underlay everything and then have to keep traveling back and forth to fill everything in. In this case, because I have 4 distinct fields, I'm going to make 4 objects. Simple as that. I'm drawing my own travel stitches in between because I don't see the need to trim between those. It's all hidden under the stitches that are going to run later on in the design. this is what I would do for that kind of piece. And what I saw was a very, very similar piece with all of these areas that weren't showing, where somebody stopped and cut a hole through most of it, but then left these little sections of fill in the areas where you would travel here. They were leaving little sections of fill in between. What I mean when I say don't use complex fills for everything and cut holes is don't go in there and cut holes under every single letter in Ahern so that you have a ton of little holes inside of this fill and it's traveling all over trying to make that fill happen and cut those little holes out, because honestly, the density is not going to cause problems under something that small and under the satin stitch, and we're going to get way more travel stitches and issues with that as well. So we can talk about that, but certainly I think that that's something that is interesting to say is like, hey, yes, it might be an object. And if we were looking at this as vector art, it very likely might have a big yellow background inside of the whole vector art. But we know that we have to draw shapes that aren't in the vector art to get what we need. In this case, we're drawing 4 shapes that are individual from each other. Here's another version of something like that. This is a design that I did for Rainbow Riders. There's a hot air balloon ride company out here. And this is another very similar one where I saw somebody doing something like this. In this blue, you can see we're occluded. These 2 pieces are completely separated. These things here between the 2 balloons, it's supposed to bump. They do not have a gap. There's no blue inside of that. But I saw somebody, like I said, showing a similar piece to this, but they instead had blue, and the blue even connected on the sides, something like this, or they had a background like this, where it was connecting on the sides, connecting in between these 2 pieces, and they were using one piece. They knocked out some areas underneath something that's very similar to where these balloons are, but they left it all connected with fill stitches in between. Whereas in this particular piece, you're going to see, yes, I did some global underlay to hold this down. It was on a dad hat that was shifting quite a lot, and it was a very light hat. Light material, and you'll see that I underlaid each piece separately. And these pieces are not one element. We actually have these 2 pieces separately. And in this case, I separated the third, but they were so close that I left them almost touching. And of course, this is done with satin stitches, so these are carved. The balloons, despite being in color, are also carved. You can see so that each one of the segments of the envelope is also having some dimension. It has shine and shadow because each piece is carved out of satin stitches. So this is another reason to do carving in color. I know I showed single color carving, but there's your multicolor carving as well, even though there's some outlining on it. But that's the thing. When we're building backgrounds, we should be looking for this and realizing that if there's discrete objects here, even though our mind says this is all one big field of color, we definitely want to separate it out. And here I'll actually show one where I could have left it in. So that's something too. Cutting a hole in the fill. And here's what Josh says, and I'll go and bring this up. Cutting a hole in the fill, true, it'll make it a higher stitch count. Not always, but it is surprising how many times it will make a higher stitch count because of all the travel stitching and the short stitches that have to happen for it to find its way in and out of all the little areas. Often enough, it can make the stitch count higher. In a case, don't get me wrong, in this case here, all of the stitches that would go onto these balloons absolutely would be more stitches than the travel stitches if you left it connected, but you're going to see a lot of unnecessary travel and density if you leave it connected in small areas that don't need to have a fill inside of them. And also, if you're talking about saying something that I always show, which is a big bar of fill stitch that has a word knocked out of it, the immense amount of complex shapes that will be there going in all of the little areas. Like if we're looking at this R on Rainbow Riders, going in and out of all the holes and the dents and the little inlets inside of the apertures in the N and the R, the E, all of those shapes, trying to travel in and back out of those with the fill stitch and with the underlay, if you set automatic underlay, can create quite a lot of travel stitching, and it can end up with poor quality stitching as well and a lot of density. So yes, it can make higher stitch counts than you might imagine. So yeah, another thing that I just think is worth bringing up. This is one where I could have actually left the fill. You have these satin stitches, you could have left the fill in. However, I decided on this particular piece, because this white with a big wide satin, we wanted these big wide satin stitches in this particular project, had a higher chance of showing through some of that high contrast. And we used, actually, this is not showing quite correctly with the red. The red that was here was kind of a very brick red. It was a darker brickish red that I thought was going to show through quite a lot with that white. White and red can be pretty brutal. And so in this case, I actually cut them apart. But what you're going to see is I didn't knock holes in the fill. It's 3 distinct sections, so it's 3 distinct fills. Could I have left those under the satin stitch? Absolutely. In this case, this wasn't so much about saving. It wasn't about saving stitch count. For me, this was about adding a little bit more barrier to having show through in the center of the column, not having as much contrasting color in the center of the column. But it still shows you that when we have a piece like this, you can elect to make multiple pieces out of it instead of knocking holes out just because they exist as a area to have holes. Certainly, there's a lot of different ways we can handle that. Without getting further into it, I just thought it would be worthwhile to say, yes, I do caution against knocking small letters out of fill is going to cause higher stitch count than you're going to save, and it's going to cause a bunch of little travel all over the place. And when you have something like this, it can be tempting to leave some of this intact and knock a hole out of it by using an automatic subtraction or something, using graphical operators to knock the hole out of that yellow background. But if it's not a clean hole that separates everything into multiple pieces, in this case, it's a real waste. And like I said, I've seen people leaving sections of fill, like somewhere up here in this corner where the A is, leaving a small section of fill between the two elements here. And when they do, they end up with a lot of excess stitch penetrations, and they travel up and down, which may also cause some issues with like rippling and pinching of fabrics, depending on the direction of stitching and if the fabric is something that's particularly shifty or loose or light. So in building backgrounds, that was something that I told you guys I would talk about. Mostly what I wanted to say is, yes, I've cautioned you against cutting holes out of fills when it's unnecessary, and that small lettering, or if you want to show through garment colors, small lettering as a cut hole through a fill often doesn't look as good as just stitching on top of it with satin in the color of the garment. But despite the fact that cutting those holes can cause issues, and that I'm not a big fan of cutting holes in fills for those reasons, sometimes you do want to cut areas away. You definitely don't want to leave everything behind there. But when you do, if there are things like this where they're entirely separated, if there are areas like this where we have a goodly amount of separation and something else is touching, in those cases, we're generally going to want to separate these islands of filled area out of the piece and not have our underlay and our fill stitch trying to calculate through some small channel of fill that we've allowed to attach between the two. We're going to either cut that area off of the shape and then draw new shapes here, cut the piece in two pieces, cut away the excess that's in here, or draw two entirely new shapes. In this case, I often digitize my own shapes on top instead of cutting them out. I digitized two different fill shapes to make that happen instead of having the one shape and cutting pieces out of it or using graphical operators. Because as you can also see, I've accounted for pull and push and other things that are going on. In this case, most of it was pretty okay. We did have a pretty close gap here. You might have been able to get away with it. In a piece like this where there's a lot of space in between, even though you could get away with having the fill inside of this area, cutting it out, and especially not having to travel back and forth. Because even in this piece, even if I had the fill go all the way to the middle on both sides on this piece, having it separate so that one portion of the underlay runs first and then the fill runs first, even if they were both touching in the middle, is still going to be more efficient as far as travel than it would be if I had just run it back and forth from the top to the bottom. And like I said, this is fairly simple and has fairly simple holes in it. When we get into more complicated holes, more complicated patterns that we're punching out, that's when we get more trouble. Like I said, you don't always want to cut everything out. In this case, you can see that under the Ahern text is a full fill, and there is no problem with that under one layer of satin stitches, and I don't see that that's going to be excessive density whatsoever. I wouldn't consider that excessive whatsoever. Wouldn't cut that out, because what I'm going to end up with is a lot more travel getting in and out of all these little nooks and crannies, and I'm going to have floating little areas of fill I'm going to have to create to fill the A and the R here. There are times where we do it. In this particular piece, this was done for applique. You can see that the background inside of this is applique. In this case, you're going to find little floating areas of fill and such. Of course, here's my tack down, and then we start doing this border. I'm going to have to float in here, fill in, and border separately on this piece, and you're going to see me doing that throughout. But this is something that is made for applique, that is not connected, that I can't hide anything on, but you can also see I'm building it out of satin stitches, and there's very little actual fill being done here. And I certainly don't just have one big bodged fill that's getting all the way inside, in and outside of all these areas. I'm actually carving it out of multiple pieces of satin as I go along so that it matches the border. And I only fill large areas where I need to, as you can see, inside the C, inside this gap between the two Fs in Redcliffe. It's a different method of doing it, and it certainly takes into account the fact that these shapes are not all something you would want to fill. And certainly, even though this area underneath Cliff, underneath Red, could be done in one big massive fill. If I did that, we'd be traveling in and out underneath all these pieces. And this was done as a very wide applique on a cap. And that would have caused some issues with registration, I would say, in the least. So in that case, I just wanted to go ahead and go over that because it's something I didn't get to cover before. And it's a topic I've been putting off and not getting to. For those of you who are still here, thank you for being here. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll get back to more classes that have more technical bent to them, more artistic bent to them, more creative bent to them as we get going. Like I said, not sure how it's going to run for next week. The likelihood, however, is we won't run a live show. I believe right during the live show, I will be in a meeting with both Jeff and someone from Madeira who was there for our panel that we're going to be doing. But you may see a recorded show or a show that is time shifted off to a different day. I'll try and do a live update anyway when I'm out there so you guys can just kind of see what's going on, and I'll talk a little bit about the show at Fort Worth. If you are interested in any other things that got commented on today, I will certainly, let me go ahead and grab for everybody the links list again to make sure everybody is able to get that stuff. If you'd like to see any of the stuff that was in the links list today, like I said, a lot of it was from the previous episode since this was a kind of a fill in to get through all the stuff that we didn't do previously. But there's the links list that we had in the commentary there. Go in the comments, grab that. But you're also going to see a couple other things that we have going on. If you want to get to that show, it is Impressions Expo at Fort Worth. That is happening next Friday is my first class, but it happens all that weekend. And that's impressionsexpo.com/Fort Worth. If you're in the Fort Worth or Dallas, Fort Worth area in Texas, feel free to come out and check us out there. You're also going to see a panel with myself and Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd being hosted by Madeira USA. So Sam Young will be hosting us out there, and that's all happening at Impressions Expo. Feel free to check that out. As we discussed briefly, if you want to check out my class on patches, it is now available for purchase as a recording at decorators.education/emblems. But I will say that is a universal class for any software to build satin edge mostly. It's mostly talking about satin edge style patch edging, but you can do other things with it. It does talk more about different techniques for small run patch making, as well as sales techniques and where they fit in as items for your product selection lineup. With that, folks, I'm happy to have had you out. I know it's kind of a weird catch-up episode. If you have things you really want to specifically talk about, I know we have some talk from Josh Hip said, future talk on black and white drawing to give a look at freehand drawing. Maybe we'll talk about that. That's something we could discuss. Certainly I can do an engraving style or blackwork style show, talk about that. And maybe we can discuss how do we make things look more handmade or more light or sketch-like. That's possible. But if you have concepts like that you want covered, if you have anything you'd like to see me talk about, contact me here in the comments, contact me on social media, wherever you find me, either through the YouTube community page, get on Facebook and get a hold of me, contact me on Twitter, Instagram, wherever I am. I may not be great at answering quick, but I always try and answer, and I'm certainly out there listening. So between you and me, folks, I hope we have more in-person time to talk to each other, but I do hope more than anything that you all stay safe and stay healthy. And I absolutely cannot wait to see you again for the next session.